Billionaire CEO finds his old school friend homeless and freezing in the blizzard. He had his coffee, his coat, his car waiting 3 steps away. The board meeting had drained him. The blizzard was getting worse, and every instinct he had said keep walking. Alex almost didn't stop, but something made him look down. A woman, a bundle pressed tight against her chest. Shoulders caved in like she'd been bracing against the cold for so long, she'd forgotten there was any other way to stand. He almost kept going. Almost. Then she looked up, and 20 years collapsed in an instant. Sarah. Not the Sarah he remembered. Not the girl who used to laugh the loudest in every room, who had plans so big they made everyone else's feel small. This was someone the world had quietly, methodically broken, and she wasn't even crying. That was the part that hit hardest. She had gone past crying. Alex didn't want the coffee. Not really. He wanted an excuse to sit somewhere quiet for 10 minutes and remember what it felt like to breathe. The board meeting had gone well. It always went well, that was the problem. Numbers up, projections solid, room full of people nodding at everything he said. And yet he'd walked out of there feeling like he'd left something behind, though he couldn't tell you what. He never could anymore. The diner was small, the kind of place that had no business being this close to the financial district. Vinyl seats, handwritten specials on a chalkboard, coffee that came in a mug with a chip on the handle. He liked it for exactly that reason. Nobody in there knew what he was worth. Nobody cared. The woman behind the counter called him Han and refilled his cup without asking, and for about 8 minutes, so Alex felt like a normal human being. Then his phone started again. 3 missed calls, 2 emails marked urgent. A message from his assistant that read, "The Dubai team needs a decision tonight." He stared at the screen long enough for the coffee to go cold, then pushed it away and reached for his coat. Outside, the blizzard had made up its mind. What had been a sulky gray afternoon was now a full whiteout. Wind cutting sideways, snow thick enough that the streetlights looked blurred, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but gets into your chest and squeezes. He pulled his collar up, tucked his chin down, and started moving toward where his driver was parked. He made it exactly 3 steps. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain what stopped him. There was no dramatic moment, no voice, no sudden instinct he could point to and call it fate. He just stopped and looked to his left at the narrow strip of wall between the diner's door and the edge of the building, where the overhang gave about 2 feet of shelter from the snow. There was a figure there, hunched, knees pulled in, a torn bag on the ground beside her, half buried already. She was wearing a coat that wasn't built for this kind of weather, and she had something pressed against her chest, bundled small, and she was bent so far over it that at first he thought she was sick. He almost kept walking. That's the truth of it, and he's never pretended otherwise, but he didn't. He took 1 step toward her, then another, and crouched down to her level because something about standing over her felt wrong. The wind screamed between the buildings. Snow was already gathering on her shoulders, like she'd been there long enough for it to settle and stay. She didn't look up right away, and in that pause, in those 2 or 3 seconds before she did, Alex had no idea that everything, every quiet, hollow, going through the motions part of his life, was about to crack wide open. She looked up, and he lost his words completely. Not because she was crying. She wasn't. That was almost worse. She had the look of someone who had moved clean through the crying stage and come out the other side into something quieter and more frightening. Her eyes were steady, exhausted in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix, and they were looking at him with that particular wariness of someone who had learned, recently and painfully, not to expect much from strangers. He knew those eyes. It took him a moment, and when the cold, the context, the sheer impossibility of it. But then it landed all at once, the way recognition always does. Not gradually, all at once. Sarah! He watched her face go through something complicated. Surprise first, then something like shame. Then, just for a second, the ghost of the girl he used to know, surfacing briefly before she pulled it back under. Alex! Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Hi. 20 years. 20 years. And she said hi like they'd run into each other at a petrol station, and he almost laughed. Would have laughed if his chest wasn't doing what it was doing. He looked at the bundle she was holding, pressed so tightly against her that he hadn't fully registered it until now. A baby, newborn from the look of it. It wrapped in what appeared to be everything Sarah owned that was soft. A scarf, a folded jumper, a muslin cloth tucked carefully around the face to block the wind. The baby was sleeping. Somehow, in all of that cold and noise and impossible circumstance, the baby was sleeping. How long have you been out here? He asked. She hesitated just long enough to tell him it was longer than she wanted to admit. Not that long. He didn't push it. He stood up slowly, looked back at the diner door, then back at her. Can you walk? I'm fine, Alex. I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked if you could walk. Something shifted in her expression. Not offense. More like she was too tired to maintain the performance of being okay in the face of someone who clearly wasn't buying it. She looked down at the baby for a second, then back up at him. Yes, she said quietly. I can walk. He got her inside. The woman behind the counter, the same one who'd called him Han, took one look at Sarah and the baby and immediately cleared a booth in the corner, the warm one near the back, away from the draft of the door. She brought a blanket without being asked. She brought warm milk and set it on the table without a word, like it was just the obvious thing to do. Alex thought, not for the first time, that ordinary people were often extraordinary in ways that never made the news. Sarah sat down carefully, adjusting the baby against her chest with the practiced, automatic movements of someone who'd been doing it alone for a while. She didn't look around the diner. She looked at the table, collecting herself. He sat across from her and waited. Outside, the blizzard pressed itself against the window glass. Inside it was warm, and the baby slept on, and somewhere in the space between them sat 20 years of separate lives that neither of them quite knew how to begin. He didn't ask her what happened. He ordered food, soup, bread, whatever was hot, and he pushed it toward her side of the table, and he waited. Some things can't be rushed. Some things have to arrive in their own time, and Alex had learned, somewhere between his 20s and now, that silence offered with intention is a form of kindness most people are starved of. She ate first. He noticed she made herself slow down. He could see the effort it took. Because hunger that deep doesn't want to be seen. The baby stayed tucked against her, one of Sarah's hands always touching her, even while the other held the spoon. A constant, quiet reassurance. I'm here. I've got you. He watched that hand and felt something tighten in his throat. After a while, she started talking. Not dramatically, not in one coherent narrative with a beginning and a middle and a moral at the end. She talked the way people talk when they're telling the truth. In pieces, circling back, stopping to correct herself, going quiet for a few seconds before picking it up again. And he listened the way he hadn't listened to anyone in years, without thinking about his response, without waiting for the point. Just listening. His name was Daniel. She'd met him at 29, married at 31. She'd thought he was the steady, grounded thing she'd been looking for after years of chasing ambition that never quite felt like enough. He was charming and attentive and said all the right things. And she had loved him genuinely for a while. The first signs were small. They always were. Money going missing from their joint account. Stories that didn't quite add up. A coldness that came and went, and which she'd been very good at explaining away, because she'd invested too much by then to easily walk back. When she found out she was pregnant, she'd been terrified and then quietly, slowly, hopeful. She'd thought it might change things. She'd thought it might bring them back to something real. He left when she was 6 months along, not with a conversation, not with the decency of a difficult, honest exchange. A note on the kitchen counter, some clothes gone from the wardrobe, and a phone that went straight to voicemail. By the time she'd understood that he wasn't coming back, that it wasn't a crisis but a conclusion, he had already cleared their shared savings account. She lost the flat a month later. She said all of this quietly, without drama, looking mostly at the table or at Grace. That was the baby's name, Grace. and only occasionally at Alex. And what struck him, sitting across from her in that small, warm booth while the storm raged outside, was not the tragedy of it, though it was tragic. It was her composure, the quiet, exhausting, relentless composure of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You should have called someone," he said gently, not as a criticism. She looked at him then, directly, and he saw something flash across her face. "Who?" she said. "My parents are gone. I lost touch with most people when I was with Daniel. He preferred it that way, I just didn't see it clearly enough at the time." She paused, "And I didn't want anyone to see me like this." "Like what?" "Like I'd failed." The words sat there between them. He didn't argue with it. He didn't rush to tell her she hadn't, because she'd heard enough empty reassurance from enough people to know the difference between comfort and truth. Instead, he just held her gaze and let her see that whatever he was feeling in that moment, and it was a lot, it was more than he'd felt in a boardroom in years. It wasn't pity. She looked back down at Grace, who was beginning to stir. "She's beautiful," Alex said. And for the first time since he'd found her outside in the snow, Sarah smiled. Small, real, brief, like sunlight through a crack in a curtain. But there, he made one phone call, stepped outside briefly, turned away from the window so she wouldn't see his face while he talked, and kept it short. Marcus was an old contact, a property manager Alex had done favors for twice over the years, the kind of favors that create the sort of goodwill people actually mean when they say, "Call me anytime." He called. He explained the situation without dressing it up. Marcus didn't ask many questions. 15 minutes later, there was a key waiting at a front desk across town. A clean furnished one-bedroom apartment, vacant since last month, no lease required yet. Heat working. Alex didn't tell Sarah any of that part. He just came back to the table, sat down and said he knew somewhere she could stay. Warm, private, no strings, as long as she needed. She looked at him for a long moment, when he could see her working through it. The pride, the wariness, the exhaustion, fighting with both of them. He'd expected the refusal. He'd had his response ready. "I'm not offering charity," he said before she could speak. "I'm offering a practical solution to a practical problem. You need somewhere safe for Grace tonight. That's the whole conversation." She looked down at Grace, who had woken fully now and was making the small preliminary sounds that precede hunger. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Not at him, he understood, but at the position she was in, at the gap between who she'd planned to be and where she'd ended up. He recognized that feeling, distantly from his own early years, though his version had never been anything like this. "Okay," she said finally, quietly. "Okay." He arranged a cab, not his car, not the driver, because that would have felt like too much, and rode with her across town, sitting beside her in the back seat while Grace fussed gently, and Sarah soothed her with a kind of automatic low-voiced calm that he found unexpectedly moving. She talked to Grace the way people talk when they think no one's really listening. Little murmured things, nearly there. "It's all right, I've got you." The apartment was on the 4th floor of a quiet building. Nothing grand. Clean walls, warm radiators, a bedroom with a proper bed already made up, a kitchen with the basics stocked. Marcus had seen to that too, without being asked. When Sarah walked in and stood in the middle of the living room and took it in, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "It's got a bath." He almost didn't catch it. "Consari?" "A bath." She turned slightly, not quite looking at him. "Grace hasn't had a proper bath yet. She's 9 days old, and I haven't been able to give her a proper bath." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He stood in the doorway and let her have the moment, watching her walk slowly into the bathroom and look at it. Just look at it, like it was something rare. Later, once Grace was fed and Sarah had eaten again, he'd ordered food up, kept it simple. He said goodnight and told her he'd check in tomorrow. She walked him to the door and stood there with Grace against her shoulder. And just before he left, she said, "Why did you stop? Outside the diner. You could have kept walking." He thought about it honestly. "I don't know. he said. I just didn't. She nodded slowly, like that was somehow the most satisfying answer he could have given her. And as he stepped into the corridor and heard the door close softly behind him, warm and certain, he thought that maybe, for the first time in a very long time, he'd done exactly the right thing. He told himself the first visit was just to check in. The second one he blamed on the fact that he was passing that side of town anyway. By the third, he stopped making excuses, even to himself. He just went. Picked up groceries or didn't, brought coffee or didn't, knocked on the door and listened for the particular sound of Sarah's footsteps before it opened. Quicker now than that first night, steadier. Grace was changing fast. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected to notice it either. The way her face was filling out, yet the way she'd started tracking movement with her eyes, the way she'd fix on something across the room with this expression of absolute concentration, like the world was a problem she was determined to solve. He mentioned it once, and Sarah laughed, really laughed, the unguarded kind, and said, "She gets that from me." And there it was, right there, the person he used to know, surfacing. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way most real things do. One afternoon she made a joke about something he'd said, sharp, perfectly timed, the kind of wit that can't be manufactured. And he'd laughed harder than he had in months, maybe longer. She looked briefly surprised by her own humor, like she'd forgotten it was there, like she'd packed it away somewhere during the Daniel years and hadn't been sure she'd find it again. Which they talked about everything and nothing, old school memories that made them both wince and grin in equal measure, the teacher who'd hated them both for different reasons, the trip in year 10 that had gone catastrophically wrong in a way that was only funny now, small things, old things, the kind of conversation that has no agenda and no outcome and is valuable precisely because of that. But they talked about the bigger things too, and that surprised him more. She asked him once, directly and without softening it, whether he was happy. Not successful, not satisfied, happy. He opened his mouth to give the standard answer, the one he gave journalists, the one he gave himself in quiet moments, and then stopped. Because she was looking at him the way she used to look at him when they were 17, like she'd see through whatever he said to whatever he meant, and there was no point performing for someone like that. "I don't know," he said. "That's honest," she said. "It's the best I've got right now." She nodded, didn't push, just sat with it, the way she learned to sit with hard things, not flinching from them, but not forcing them either. And in that quiet, something shifted in him, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just a small, significant loosening of something he'd been holding very tightly for a very long time. He'd spent 20 years building a life that looked exactly the way he'd planned it, and somehow, sitting in a modest apartment, drinking instant coffee, while a 9-day-old baby slept in the next room, he felt more like himself than he had in years. He didn't say that out loud, but he thought she probably knew. The job came through on a Tuesday. He hadn't engineered it the way she might have feared. He hadn't called in a favor that would leave her feeling like a placement rather than a person. He'd mentioned her once to someone who ran a small nonprofit that did financial advocacy work. Mentioned her background, her experience, the particular kind of intelligence she had for systems and people, and the quiet space where those two things met. He'd said she was exceptional. He'd meant it. The rest was hers. She went to the interview on her own, Grace with a childminder for 2 hours, and she came back and called him and said she'd got it before he'd even had a chance to ask how it went. Her voice was different on that call. But he noticed it immediately. Something in it that had been absent since he'd found her outside the diner. Not happiness exactly, though it was that too. Something beneath the happiness. Something structural. She sounded like herself again. The new flat came 2 weeks later. A modest place, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen that got the morning light. Nothing that would appear in a magazine, nothing that needed to. She moved in on a Saturday with very little to move, which she said didn't bother her. And he believed her, because he was starting to understand that Sarah's relationship with material things had been quietly, permanently recalibrated by everything she'd been through. She knew now, in the way you can only know something by losing it, what actually mattered and what was just furniture. He helped carry things up the stairs. She made him do it himself rather than hiring anyone, which he suspected was her way of keeping him normal, and he didn't complain. When the last box was in and they were sitting on the floor of the living room because there was no furniture yet except for Grace's things. Always Grace's things first. Always. She looked around the space slowly, taking it in. He watched her do it and didn't speak, because this was her moment and he knew better than to fill it with words. Then she said, "I forgot what it felt like, to have somewhere that's just mine." He asked her what it felt like now. She thought about it properly, the way she did with questions that deserved a real answer. "Like I can breathe in a straight line," she said. He didn't entirely know what that meant, but he understood it completely. Grace was in her chair near the window, it awake and content, watching the light move across the wall with that same focus, serious expression she'd had since the beginning. Sarah looked at her daughter, and the look on her face was something Alex couldn't have named if he'd tried. Love, obviously, but also something fiercer than love. A kind of determination, a promise. He looked away because it felt too private to witness for long, but he carried it with him for days afterwards, that look. Long after he'd left, long after he was back in his own world of boardrooms and decisions and things that used to feel important, he carried it like something he'd been given without fully deserving. It was Sarah who suggested the dinner, a proper one this time, a restaurant, not her floor, not his kitchen, not a diner booth in a blizzard. Somewhere in the middle, in every sense. But she'd booked it herself, paid for her own seat, and told him not to argue about the bill in a tone that made it clear arguing would be pointless. He arrived first and sat with a glass of water and realized he was nervous, which was absurd. He negotiated deals worth 9 figures without his heart rate moving. And yet, she came in with Grace in a carrier against her chest, still too small to leave for a long evening, and she was wearing something that wasn't shaped by survival or practicality or whatever, was clean. She looked like herself, the version of herself that had always been there, underneath the cold and the exhaustion and the careful composure. He stood up when she reached the table because it felt like the right thing to do, and she rolled her eyes at him affectionately and sat down. They ordered. They talked. They covered ground that was easy and ground that wasn't, moving between the two without the conversation ever feeling heavy. At some point, Grace fell asleep between them and the carrier, and the conversation went quieter and more honest the way it tends to when a sleeping baby's involved. Like the whole room agrees to be a little more real. Somewhere toward the end of the meal, Sarah set down her glass and looked at him with the directness he'd come to understand was just how she was. Not confrontational, just incapable of being indirect when something genuinely mattered. "I want to say thank you," she said. "Not for the apartment or the connection or any of the practical things, though those mattered, but for stopping, outside the diner. You didn't have to stop." "Anyone would have stopped," he said. "No," she said, simply and without cruelty. "They wouldn't. You know that." He did know that. He just hadn't wanted to say it. "You saw me," she said. That was the thing. Not the situation, not the problem to be solved. You saw me. And that was what made it possible to accept anything else. He held that for a moment, turned it over. "You gave me something back," he said eventually. "I want you to know that." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I'd spent so long becoming this..." He paused because the words for it weren't quite right. "This version of myself that functions really well, runs well, performs well. And I'd stopped asking whether I actually liked him, whether I wanted to keep being him." He looked at her steadily. "You reminded me what it felt like to do something that mattered, just mattered. No strategy, no return on investment, just the thing itself." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were always like that. You just buried it under everything else." Outside the window, the last of winter was releasing its grip. The snow that had defined the beginning of all of this, the blizzard, the wall, The bundle pressed tight against a stranger who turned out to be someone he knew, had long since melted. The street was dry. The sky, even at this hour, held the faint early warmth of something turning. Grace stirred, made a small sound, settled again. He looked at her sleeping there, this person who had arrived into the worst moment of her mother's life, and somehow, without doing anything at all, made people want to be better, and felt something quietly, permanently settle in his chest. Not an ending. A beginning that had already begun without him noticing. He picked up his glass. Sarah picked up hers. No speech, no toast. Just two people who had found each other again on the wrong side of a storm, sitting in the warmth of what came after.